Well, we will get started and welcome to everybody. Nice to see everybody, as I said. We're going to continue. We changed the format of the webinar a little bit last fall to start kind of topically for the first half an hour and then jump into whatever questions and things that are happening for you that you would like to chat about with each other or with MASB staff. We have a handful of MASB staff on today. Brad is on, of course, because we could not do one of these webinars without him on, or there wouldn't be anybody tuning in. But for today, our guest that'll start the conversation with me, Debbie Stair, our Assistant Director of Leadership Services, is on today. And I know that most people probably are not thinking about this right now because it's January. But people need to be thinking about the November election for school board and starting to plan for that. Like as a district, are you having the conversation? Do you know if your incumbents that are up this year are running again? Um, so Debbie and I are going to spend a little bit of time talking about that, what MASB is going to do to help prepare you guys with candidates and other things. But we just are in a place where, we've been working the election idea over the last now 8 years, where we've had our Get On Board campaign to focus on making sure that every seat that is open gets filled by somebody that runs for office. And we've been kind of diligent in our work in that area. And really, it's about talking to districts and making sure you're all prepared for that. I sometimes joke that democracy is wonderful until it's not. And that really has to do with if you as a board or as a district depend on, oh, somebody's going to run. We see a lot of things happen. We see people don't run and you have empty elections and you appoint somebody. We see people that get elected that might have agendas because nobody ran against them. Like there's lots of things that happen if a board doesn't start thinking and preparing for an election. So, um, Debbie, I'll bring you into the conversation and just start with and people post questions in the chat, um, or raise your hand and we'll call on you. But Debbie, give them kind of what you would give. And I know you do these in our town hall meetings in the spring, but what do you say to introduce this topic to boards and the importance of preparing for the election cycle?
Well, it's interesting of the timing of this particular member matters because we just put together the final touches for our presentation for the superintendent's conference. And they'll actually be hearing about this topic on Thursday because it really is something that's not that far away. When you think about it, the filing deadline is in July. And so what should we be doing now to think about that election? And my first thing that I always tell boards, not only about this topic, but probably a lot of others as well, is be proactive. Don't sit back and wait for whatever happens to you. Most of us would not do that in our everyday lives. And so, why on earth would we sit there at the board table as a really important part of the district and the governance team of the district to say, well, whoever shows up at our door is who we're going to work with? When instead we could be proactive about that and really sort of line up some folks, making sure there are people ready and willing to serve, whether it's a board vacancy or an election.
Yeah, one of the things, Debbie, that I talk to superintendents and or board members about is kind of that difference. Some people get really nervous about recruitment. And what I tell them is you don't have to recruit a person. It's not that I'm sitting on a board and I'm recruiting Debbie to run for that board. Now, you can do that individually and have those conversations, but I always encourage, and Michael posted that they have 4 seats open this year. Some of those will likely get, incumbents running. There might be some other vacancies. I always tell boards, have an open conversation in a meeting. Like we know that, let's just say 2 seats are going to be vacant. Our incumbents are not running again, and have a conversation about what are you looking for as a type of person, skill set? What are we losing off the board from a knowledge background? And almost create a job description or a profile of what would serve that board well, and then go out and recruit on the profile. Go to a Rotary Club and say, here's what we're looking for. Go to PTA meetings and say, here's what we're looking at. Not who we're looking for, but this is the what of what that person's skill set, knowledge kind of thing would be.
Yeah, I think in addition to skill set, there's a few other things, right? Is again, if we've been proactive, we've created opportunities in our districts for people to get leadership opportunities. We've had district-wide committees, we've had building committees where people have had an opportunity to learn more about the district, participate, in some various roles that give them a better understanding of what they might be stepping into. And so again, that goes back to that proactive piece, right? We're setting the stage so that we actually have a pool of people who potentially are already prepared in some respects because at least they have, some knowledge about how the district runs. And then, like you said, going out and not being afraid to have the conversation. I think many times we're afraid to broach those topics because there's the whole idea around, oh, I'm going to keep it secret and not say anything about whether or not I'm running until the deadline appears. And what often happens there is that some good folks who are community minded and who are student focused might sit back and never consider running only because they didn't know that there was going to be a seat that, maybe not even filed for. And so I think the earlier we talk about it and get it out there, and share the information, we're going to have a much better pool of candidates who might consider running. And then we can come in and help there to sort of help fine tune their expectations about the work.
I see Dr. Early, you have your hand up. If you'd like to share something or ask a question.
Yes, I would like to actually share something. So I had someone that said, "Oh, I really thinking about joining the school board. I have an interest." What I did with them is I invited them to the school board meetings. I said, first of all, if you want to become a school board member, you have to know what it looks like. And so I invited them to the school board meeting. I have been talking to them and asking them questions on why do you want to be a school board member? What is your interest? Have you been to the schools to see what they're like and the children there? Do you understand the things that go along with being in this political space? And so they now is seeing is not just us up there saying yes or no to an agenda item. They're seeing it from the inside, kind of. Like they don't know any of the private stuff, but they like, okay, y'all meeting sometime run to noon, to from 6 to 8 or 6 to 9 when I got to be at home at a specific time for my children, like that kind of stuff. They're starting to see that the dynamic of the board themselves. They see how we talk to one another. They see how if we joke or we don't joke, or if what's serious. They see the vendors that come in, that type of stuff. And so that's one of the biggest things. If they want to be there, you got to pull them into the space where you are so they can see what they're going to expect to have. They're not going to be shocked about what's going on.
Yeah, I think those are great ideas, great process. You start moving into the idea, then what sharing with people what the culture of the board is, right? Like it's not just from an election standpoint, you're running for the board, but letting people know what happens from a work perspective, but also the expectations, how the board interacts with each other. What are, I think back to MASB's governance standards. What do we expect of ourselves as individuals in a board, and what do we expect of the whole board as a body, and how they act and how they interact with the public and within themselves. So I think those are really good places. And with that, Debbie, I'm going to turn to you on she laid out kind of really explaining to candidates or interested people what it's like to be on a school board. So going back years, we started town hall meetings. We started with them in person at ISDs. During COVID, of course, we were forced to move into a virtual space, and ended up with actually getting many more people participating And so Debbie, if you want to lay out, I think we've got those set up already for this year. And this will be, of course, shared out with districts, but it'll be a great place to point your people that are interested or mention it to you into taking advantage of maybe one of these webinars.
Yeah, so if you haven't heard of Get On Board before, and Larissa just put the link in there for you, um, it really is intended for folks who are considering running, and all of the town halls are held before the filing deadline. This year, we'll start those town halls in the beginning of January, or not January, sorry about that, June. And we'll have one pretty much once a week until the filing deadline happens. And those town halls will be advertised on the website at that link. And we talked to the group about, really thinking carefully about what they're about to potentially sign up for, right? So do they really understand first the requirements to be a school board member? Then what really is the role of a board member? A lot of times when people decide to run, they think that board service is one thing. I'm sure some of you have seen that on your own boards. For them to get on the board, win their election, and then find out that it looks very different than what they had anticipated. So we're very frank with them, talking to them about really what are the duties of a board member. And then we also talk to them about, okay, so if you think this is the right time and the right office for you, then here's some things to consider. We talked to them about the 8 traits of an effective board. We talked to them about the governance standards. Both of those documents are on that website, downloadable. And we even encourage districts to hand that out to folks who are considering or who have, had some interest potentially in running in the future. And then we also talk to them about what kinds of things should they expect after they win an election around their area of their own development, so that they understand coming into it that they don't have everything that they need. They don't have all the knowledge that they'll need to be a good board member. They really need to put a plan in place with their district, helping them to talk about their development. So it's just an hour long. Again, we've intended it for folks who have not been on the board before, but I will tell you, we also get some currently sitting board members on there who just kind of want a refresher. It's been a few years since they ran. They want to hear what we have to say. Is there something new they don't know? We do not talk to them about how to run a campaign. That's always one question we get. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is to make sure they have the facts that they need so that they're informed when they decide to put their name on that ballot.
Debbie, you said something earlier that just gave me a thought. You were talking about going to those the members that have sat on committees and building bond issues and all of those things. And when I was talking about, creating a profile for a school board member, you started, and you also talked about, people that have a skill set. And I don't know how many of you on the call fall into this place. And sometimes it's when somebody says, well, sometimes you need to ask people to run. They want to be asked. And some people have a negative view on, if they don't want to run themselves, they don't, why should I ask them, sort of thing. But it would not surprise me. We've got 65 people on the call. If a number of you had somebody make a direct ask and say, hey, you should really think about running. So while we look at the idea of a profile and be recruiting in a generic way to let people know that you're looking in the skills and knowledge and all of that, Debbie brought up that pool of candidates that are natural to school board work, which would be the PTAs and the committees and things within your district. Those are the places where you might have somebody that has served, on a elementary PTA and a middle school and a high school and a bond committee, and they like that work. They don't have to go knock on doors to get to do that work. And they've thought about school board, but they're just, I'm not sure. The nudge might just be that direct ask. So while you wouldn't talk about saying as a board at a board meeting, oh, let's recruit Debbie, you as an individual might be like, man, I think Debbie would be really good in this role. And I'm going to go talk to her and at least extend that, that idea to run. And if you think about when you have an appointment on a board, we always have more people that show up to be appointed to a board then run for the board, right? And I think it's because people find running for office pretty daunting, particularly now that we're running in November. But at the same time, so many people, and I think many of you would bear that out, if you're asked to run, you do it. You're willing to do it when asked. So when you have those good people, and you know that you're going to have vacancies on your board, make sure once you've talked about what you're looking for, if this person or persons, right, you can ask more than one person to think about running. Like, make sure you're reaching out in that space and making the ask.
Yeah, I think the key there too, Don, you said it's not just necessarily one person, it might be a number of people. Because when you do reach out, it might not be the right time for that individual right then and there, but it doesn't mean that they won't be ready sometime in the future. The board member who took my seat when I left my board service, we had talked to her a couple of earlier times along the way, and she just wasn't ready due to her own, family situation. But when I left, it was the right time for her. And so that's where there's an advantage to having multiple people out there who you think would make, a good team member. And I think, in addition to those skill sets that you want to think about, you want to think about what's their commitment to ethics, right? Especially in this time period that we're going through. What's their willingness to learn? Do they really feel like they know everything when they would come onto the board, or is there an understanding that there's learning involved and they want to be a part of that? And a commitment to teamwork, because you all have learned, right? It takes a lot of work to get something, through. And the more you're a team, the more effective you're going to be as a board anyway on all issues. But that willingness to be a part of a team is not something everybody comes to this seat thinking they need to worry about that. They're just going to advocate for whatever they want. And we all know that's not the way things get done. And so those are just a couple of other pieces that you want to think about in that frame.
Tony.
Just a quick comment. Just to piggyback on that, the key part that you brought up there, Debbie, is the education, because vetting or trying to reach out towards a new potential board member, they have to be on board with the education piece, because that's where those expectations I've seen in my years, it gets changed, where people expect one thing and then another. It's just when they are educated and we kind of pre-educate them on things based on our education, going through like MASB training, we're kind of setting the atmosphere, so then that way they know it's not just show up at a meeting and then that's it. There's a whole bunch of other things that they have to be on board with. So the education piece and the willingness to want to go to education, and I know it's based on our board policy, individual board policies on how that's being pushed, but to be able to encourage that, and they seek that type of person that would want to have not just the minimum, but the necessary education and ongoing education that they need to be effective as a board and as a team.
Appreciate that, Anthony. And as you said, that is kind of a district by district. And I've told people, like, clearly, if you can find somebody that's willing to learn, like Debbie said, and understand the role, I think that's important. But we also have to understand people are in different spaces in their life. And so, as Debbie mentioned, you had a board member that you recruited a couple times that passed because it wasn't the right time. They eventually commit because it works for them. But even then, their time still might be limited. So that pursuit of additional education can be hampered because of just their life. But at least from MASB perspective, we now offer a lot more things online so that we can bring it to people that are on your board rather than always having them come to us to try to help that out. But Nick, I appreciate your comment about the recruitment space. I think, I don't think there's anybody that doesn't like when somebody asks them, right? It's just what it makes you, it reaffirms maybe the work that you've done. It makes you feel like I haven't wasted my time and the work that I've done in the past. And so I do think that that ask is really effective. And Matthew, your comment about student school board members is spot on. Like if you have people that have sat on your board as student board members and they're now out of school and still live in your community, whether that's because they're now just working in jobs, it's because they're in a community college, whatever that might be, like those are individuals that really understand the work of the board from the time that they watched your local board operate. And I can speak to a handful of people, Debbie, probably even more, of people that we have had in our membership that started along with Matthew, that started as student board members and became sitting board members and really good board members on their board. I think in some ways that's when districts create the student board, it's to get in student involvement, but it is to create a farm team of people that could know the board work and then run for board later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Josie had a question. What is the status of legislation? Yes, great question on the partisan board offices. So Jen testified on that in committee. It is still sitting. We don't have any, we thought it was going to go away in the House, like maybe even in committee, it wasn't going to get any further. Interestingly, and this is kind of right to give you an idea, you look at our membership is very diverse. So in that case, the legislation itself was asked for by a school board member. Like they really see it as logical to have partisan board elections. They went to their legislators. That individual testified in support of the legislation. We ended up having 2 hearings on it. Right now, our understanding would be if it were to move through, that the Senate doesn't have a lot of interest in taking that up. I know that Jen and Brenda and myself have all talked to our counterparts nationally because this conversation isn't just in Michigan. But right now, kind of where it was before, not with an expectation that it's going to become law anytime soon or even get any further action. But a good question for an update, and that's a very timely as we think about what we're talking about here. And we know that boards have become some boards. Sadly, they have become more about partisan politics. They're not partisan because they don't have D's and R's behind their name. And I've told legislators for years when this has come up is like we've always had board members that are D's and R's and I's. They just didn't have a reason to talk about it. There wasn't a platform when they were a local board member that they were banging on tied to their state party. It was they came together as 7 members to govern a district, and now we are seeing more of this. I'm here to represent some faction of my community, whether it be a neighborhood, a political view, a specific issue. It's kind of the nature of society today, but I'm still thankful that most of our boards and even some of those that get elected in that mindset end up folding into that board culture and understanding that that's not what a board is. And so we will continue to fight if that continues to come up or move. We only have a handful of states that have any kind of partisan elections, and we don't want to be another one of those. And that's a position through our Government Relations Committee and our Board of Directors. It's not just Jen and I deciding that, it's from the membership.
So sort of related to that, not I exactly, but something to think about as far as the election goes. For those of you that are up for re-election this year, and maybe in prior years, you didn't have to do much campaigning. Maybe you didn't have, someone running against you and you find yourself in a different situation this year. My advice is don't take your re-election for granted. Like if you want the seat, know that the other people who want the seat are going to campaign. And if you sit back and think, all the things I've worked on all these years and all of the decisions I've been a part of that have been, positive things for the district should carry me through. That's not necessarily true. You really need to say, I want this job and here's why I'm the best person for it. And so, that's my advice there. And then the other piece to this too is have conversations early too about what does it look like at the board table? How do we do our best to keep the campaigning away from the board business? They're two very separate things, but I bet some of you, just like I have over the years, have seen that campaigning seep its way into what's happening at the board table. And so having those conversations early about what that looks like and how we might, stem that, I think are important pieces that will be useful.
Mark, you asked a question a little bit outside of the elections, but a valid question. So Brenda's at a funeral today and Jen is off. And so I apologize that we don't have the expertise on the call today, but an update for activities for NSBA Advocacy Institute. So we are still planning our Senate breakfast, still planning on having our get together as Michigan in the lunch space on, I guess it would be Sunday. But I will tell you that, though, like the piece at the hotel will happen. That's easy. What we don't know is because we don't know what's going to happen with the government if it shuts down or doesn't shut down. We may be in a situation that on Tuesday morning, when we would normally have our breakfast on Capitol Hill, the Capitol Hill might be closed. Like it might, I mean, the timing of Advocacy Institute this year, tying into this idea of a government shutdown on the federal level, just could create difficulties. So soon as we're going to continue that, the team will continue to communicate with those that are registered so that but it is we've got a little bit up in the air this year as it relates to what does it look like if the government shuts down, and many of the workers that would make the breakfast would not be around that day. So we'll update you as we know more in that, and we will update everybody on site as well when we get together on Sunday. Alan, our term is 6 years. That's one of the challenges of recruitment. That's a long, absolutely. And Debbie, I know you've probably talked to the data from our database. I can tell you about half of the districts in the state run 4-year terms, about half in the state run 6-year terms. I've heard that same thing about recruitment. That can be difficult to get them, but at the same time, once they get elected, they like not having to run for office 4 years down the road because it's a 6-year term. So it's kind of a mix. And as you can see from people responding, lots of districts are 6-year terms. Brad, this might get into your area, but I know these questions come up every year. Can school board members endorse other people or other board members that are running for office? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that legally, yep, they can endorse if they want to.
Yeah. You just can't incur any public expense in doing that, right? You can't use state funds and in endorsing another board member, and obviously that could create some friction depending upon if the individual that you're endorsing against gets elected to the board. But yeah, as a individual school board member, you don't give away your right to be involved in elections, and certainly you can support someone, endorse them under the Campaign Finance Act. That's not an issue as long as no public expense is involved.
And as Brad said, oh, Debbie, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Brad made a good point there about, you don't know who you're going to serve with. And so I think you should be at least cautious about what kinds of words you use and in those endorsements and how far out on that limb you're willing to go, because ultimately someone else might be sitting at that table next to you and it's not the person you endorsed. And how do you now come together and still, be that team that we know is so important in governance?
Yeah, I think both of them, just talking about that, it's from MASB's perspective, it is a risky proposition. It probably doesn't lead to at least easy positive relationships upon an election if you've endorsed somebody that lost and now their opponent is sitting at the table. And on the flip side, I understand, like if you have somebody that you view as kind of running against the board, like they have not been happy with you as a board, they think you have failed the community, I understand why you would end up endorsing other people. But even in that case, like we've seen it on boards where somebody that's running in some ways against the board or on an issue kind of can be folded into your board culture and they adapt over time, but that will be harder to do if you took that you took an active role in trying to not let them on the board. So, I would just be very aware of how you process that. I would say in most cases, most board members stay away from endorsing, but we, of course, are seeing more of that where board members endorse a slate of candidates or endorse individual candidates. But I really wanted to be able to get it is legal to do it because I know that question comes up probably every year on whether you can do it or not. And I appreciate Brad being able to clarify that for people. Looking, let's see here if Susan, ways to get more people interested. Debbie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think it goes back to, those lower level opportunities for engagement and, participation in the district and using that as a sort of feeding ground or, to start looking for people who may or may not be, someone to sit at the table ultimately. I mean, I came up through the ranks of PTA. I know a number of other board members did as well, but there are a lot of other groups out there that, may have a potential candidate. I think, Don, you mentioned going to one of the civic groups earlier. Is there someone from the faith-based community? Is there someone from maybe a children's activity league in the community that isn't necessarily attached to the school district, but a lot of people participate in? There's all kinds of different organizations within your community. If some of you have an educational foundation, that might be another route. So it's just a matter of being creative and thinking, where might people be, and then talking to them, reaching out to them, as we talked about early on in the session.
So I just want to say with our group,
now
you just muted yourself.
You just muted yourself. You were off before. There you go.
Yes, I see that now. Anyways, we have a very non-conflictive district. We don't have a lot of people. We don't have anybody come to our meetings. They're content with how things are run. And that's kind of nice sometimes. But at the same time, they're like, why should we run? We'll just let so-and-so stay on, and we'll let so-and-so stay on. And I think they forget to look at some of the people's ages and their health. It's a concern for me at times. I myself, I know I won't be running in 2 years. So I'm looking for somebody to say, hey, come on, fill my spot. Take over. Come on in.
Well, and Susan, there's always the opportunity to determine that maybe instead of having an election for a seat, that you choose to vacate your seat early.
Oh, yeah.
Don mentioned earlier that sometimes people are willing to come forward for that application process that aren't necessarily going to put their name on a ballot. And so, that's another way of doing it. I've seen some districts sort of use that as a tool. And it has been successful for them in finding folks that, they feel, come to the team with an approach that is useful and positive. So something else to think about.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, and I also think, Susan, clearly if the median age of your board is 7 years old, you might be going to events within your school, but kind of your peer group is no longer the parents of your students, right? Like you don't have a bunch of 35-year-olds that you're regularly interacting with. And so it's like, who do I recruit out of a group that I don't know? And so I do think Debbie mentioned it, it is figuring out, how do I get in front of parents of the kids in the district, right? What way is that? Is that at if it's PTA meetings at your elementary buildings and actually having your superintendent put the board president or somebody from the board on there, or frankly, even the superintendent can pass along if the board has the conversation and says, here's what we're looking for. The superintendent can pass that along. And I would always tell a soup not to be an individual recruiting like an individual run. That's a difficult spot for a superintendent,
He
but
stays out of it.
they can pass along what the board has said. Like the board is really looking for somebody. If they're doing a presentation to a PTA, they can carry that. If they're a member of the Rotary Club, they can carry that message if the board member isn't, available to go or whatever. So it really has to be outreach into groups that you aren't maybe a member of yourself any longer.
Very good. Thank you.
Well, I see we're at 12:38, and I've just seen, I know Brad has kind of tried to answer it, and I will too, but Kurt asked a question about 31A. Other questions, Debbie, any last comments on elections before we go into just kind of a open conversation?
Yeah, I was hoping you'd give me that opportunity. There's one more thing that, I think now is the perfect timing. And I would sort of refer to it as putting your house in order. If you don't have norms that are written and adopted, and you don't have board operating procedures, some people call them protocols, now is the time to do that. You have plenty of time between now and the election cycle to really put some of those things in place that have been serving your board really well. And oftentimes I'll find boards where, gosh, things are going well, just like Susan said. Gosh, we're getting along, everything, we're doing fine. And sometimes those boards don't have those agreements written down and agreed to. And then someone new comes along and kind of upsets the way we've been doing things. And there's no rules for anybody to follow, right? And so take the time now, if you don't have norms or a code of conduct, or maybe you don't have, an operating procedure about what kind of support we provide to our board members and what kind of training, we want them to take place in, and, a whole number of other things. Think about doing that now. And if you have questions about it, feel free to reach out. We can give you some lists of suggestions in both of those areas. But it's much easier to put those kinds of tools in place when things are going well and when there's a team already intact that's been working together versus, oh, now we have 1, 2, 3, who knows how many new board members sitting at the table. And it's kind of a everybody for themselves kind of atmosphere. And that's what you don't want. You want to make sure that your community can still have faith in the governance team of the district. And so think about doing some of those things now while you still have the time to do them. It really helps to smooth out transitions, whether they're challenging transitions or not. Having those things in place can be very helpful.
Debbie, I'm so glad that you brought that up. That is a big deal when you come into an election year. I talk to a lot of superintendents and I get the same answer you just talked about, which is, things are great on the board. Like and it's like, well, that's the time when you adopt. How did you get to great? Like what made you great? How come that's working so well? Put that down on paper so that it can be lived forward and brought forward for new people coming in. So glad that you brought that up. I think that is essential to kind of a good transition into new board members. James, you have your hand up.
Yes, sir. With the content that Debbie provided for us, I also think that's a great time when you do your new board member orientation to have them go through that and verbally agree, or some even sign it so that way they say, well, I didn't know, I was unaware, this is how we did things, or I thought it was like this. I think that new board member orientation is crucial, and that's a good time for Q&A for that board member to let them know their expectations.
Thanks for that, James. Absolutely. And that is a growing area, right, Debbie? Like we're seeing a lot more, and I think it's great that districts are taking it on. And we've done stuff in leaderboard. Debbie's written articles, but we're moving into a different section. But like once the election is over, onboarding new board members effectively into the role, the culture, their responsibilities it can make or break the success of that transition. And I'm glad to see that more districts are spending time talking about what does an orientation and onboarding process look like.
Now,
Those
there are a number of ISDs in both of the last election cycles that have invited us out, and they've invited in their brand new board members from across the county. And we've talked to them about, what kinds of things should they be able to expect from their districts in that onboarding process, and we provide them with information as well. And so, think about going back to your ISDs and asking, are they participating in that to help you with that process?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see Stephanie on here from Clarkston, and we highlighted some work that Clarkston did in the last election cycle to bring in a board member that they thought was going to be a tough transition, and it's worked very well. And so we have examples of things that can be helpful on onboarding and transitioning board members as well. So Brad, you had a question on 31A, of course, or double A. We knew that was going to come. You answered as far as Plan B. I can tell you, Kurt, that both Jen and Brenda and all of the school lobbyists, as soon as 31AA became a part of the School Aid Act, immediately conversations were happening with lobbyists, or not with lobbyists, with legislators last fall to try to get things changed, even before we ended up in the legal space that we're in. And we frankly didn't get they didn't get a lot of receptivity. I think that we've now seen, I just answered a board member from the UP via email last week that had questions on this. They had just met with their senator and their House member, and more legislators are now hearing from districts, like the problems this has caused, the difficulty that they're in. So I think there's likely going to be more legislative interest. On the flip side, I know from conversations that Jen had in December, we also had legislators saying, well, it's a legal issue now. We'll wait until the courts decide. So some of them took the legal efforts that we're making as an excuse to not do anything more. So it's kind of a mixed space, but they will continue to talk with legislators. They just came back into session last week. And so those conversations will be ongoing. Sadly, it might be, something that doesn't get addressed legislatively until the school aid budget conversation happens for next year, unless the courts make some decisions. And Brad, if you want to get into what the current timelines for some of those are at, so at least people know. And we are, as far as MASB goes, I will say that we will be a part of, along with many of the other kind of ed management groups. We've got briefs involved in the cases that are out there. We're working in concert with the Troon law firm in that space to do that. And so we're involved as much as we can be, both on the legal side and on the legislative side of this. But Brad, if you want to fill them in and update them on where the different court cases rest.
Sure. And just one quick point on elections before I get into that. For those of you who've had vacancies on your board, so you had a resignation since the last election, know that if that vacated term goes beyond 2026, you're going to have an abbreviated term on your 26 ballot, whether if it's a 2-year term or a 4-year term, and make folks aware of that. To Alan's point, if you have folks that 6 years is too long, and if you've had a vacancy and now you have a 2-year term or a 4-year term on your ballot, say, hey, if you don't want to run for a 6-year term, you can run for this abbreviated term. And you need to declare that on your affidavit of identity and your petition. If you're circulating petitions, if you pay the filing fee, then you just identify the term that you're running for on your affidavit of identity, but make that abbreviated term known in your community, so you don't have 10 people running for full terms, 2 full-year terms, and no one running for that abbreviated term, because they have to put that on that affidavit of identity or on their petitions if they circulate them. So on to Section 31AA. During the holiday break, we had a decision on that from the Court of Claims. And as you all likely know, the Court of Claims upheld the constitutionality of Section 31AA. rejected all of the school district plaintiffs' arguments. And our primary argument was that it was overly broad and there were lots of terms that were not clarified by the law. So we were kind of entering into an unknown. If you accept the funds, if you opt into the funds, and then you're going to be subject to these overly broad requirements that are found in Section 31 AA. The Court of Claims did not agree with that argument. In response to that decision, the plaintiffs filed an emergency appeal with the Court of Appeals, and the court did grant that emergency appeal, but did not grant the motion to issue a decision on the merits prior to December 30th. So if your districts have opted in and did not opt out, so the opt-in deadline was December 4th, and after the decision on December 17th, there was still time to opt out. But if your districts have not opted out and they remain into the opt-in category of receiving those Section 31 AA funds, as of today, you're subject to the requirements of 31 AA. So if you have a mass casualty event, you cannot keep your attorney-client privilege confidential related to that mass casualty event. That would have to be waived, and that would only be subject to waiving if you're a part of the investigation as well. Now, the Court of Claims did address a lot of the issues that were brought up and provided guidance on how the law could be interpreted, but it's important to know that the Court of Claims decision isn't binding in regard to the opinions that judge took on a lot of these issues that were brought up. The opinion is not providing precedent in regard to how that waiver is going to be applied. So just know that while you're hearing the court did address those issues, likely not binding precedent in terms of the Department of Education isn't required to follow that, or the executive branch isn't required to follow the guidance that was in the opinion issued by the Court of Claims. So when will we receive a decision? Sometime maybe in February or March. While the Court of Appeals did accept it on appeal and wanted and put it on an expedited path based on the briefing schedule in that order, we're not going to see a decision until probably later in February or maybe even March. And on the federal side of things, the plaintiffs in the case also filed a federal claim. That's in a holding pattern. It's believed that the federal court is waiting for the issue to be worked out at the state level, and then we'll refer to the state court. So we're probably not going to get much assistance on this issue from the federal courts. Whatever is decided in our state courts, that's what we're going to be bound with.
Thanks for that, Brad. And so kind of as I said, right, like the timing of the courts now it's kind of slowed down. So clearly this is we are going to be dependent on you as board members and your superintendents to bring this up with legislators. I posted in response to somebody, I think very few legislators, when the bill passed last fall, were even aware this language was in there because of the way that it was brought about. The whole bill was brought about this year. I don't think hardly any of them should be able to claim lack of knowledge now because boards and soups have talked to them about it. But it's either a legislative fix or it is going to be legal. We've already lost one battle at the court level, at the Court of Claims. So in some ways, I'm putting a little more hope in trying to address this legislatively. The timing will be, though, for some districts at least, and I don't know how they'll work this out, Brad. If they decide, let's just say we lobby it, and I don't think they would go this far, but let's just say they delete the language from the School Aid Act that for when they pass the budget bill for next year. I don't know what that does to those that at least in the current year, because if you opted in and now you're giving up those rights, I'll call them, even though if that might be a bad term. If it's deleted, have you still given those up? That's going to be a question that comes up depending on how the legislature addresses this.
Yeah, I think if we address this legislatively, we need to make clear that if you opted in for the Section 31 AA funds, that opt-in, only applies for the 25-26 fiscal year. So if you have a mass casualty event, down the road and you opted in this year, you're not going to be subject to those requirements. I think that's what I would like to see, Don, to provide that clear clarification on that.
Yeah, I'm sure that that will be pursued. When we were talking about it, really, even in the fall and December, there was already kind of a begrudging acceptance to the idea of outside parties maybe doing, or the state coming in to do a kind of a third party review of a situation or a mass casualty event. It really was a fight, and even the court cases are really fighting about that attorney client privilege piece of this. And so, if we're going to have success legislatively, yes, we're going to try to get the whole thing taken out. That would be our goal. But at a minimum, we want to address the attorney-client privilege piece because that we just like the long-term impact of that is so unknown and how it applies. It will be a nightmare for districts. Whereas, honestly, our belief was in the mass casualty event in Oxford, had Attorney General Nessel said, as the chief law enforcement officer in the state of Michigan, that she wanted to come in and have a study or like a post-event, investigation done. I don't think anybody could have stopped her from doing that. So there is I think, a belief from many that that existed, like that right for the state to step in and do an investigation existed already. And in some ways, putting it in the school aid bill really doesn't, have much of an impact. I think in the Oxford case, in many ways, the Oakland County prosecutor did not want the state involved because they had criminal proceedings that they were dealing with, and they wanted it to be a little cleaner than having another investigation going on. But so we will continue to fight this legislatively, but there's a good chance that if you have legislators, and this happened with the UP one, they legislators love to say this. Well, we might have a supplemental, which is a budget bill that affects the current budget rather than next year's budget, and they can do appropriations in it. I will tell you, in most cases, that's a cop out. We don't have supplementals very often. Everybody thinks there's always a bill introduced that is a supplemental bill. They don't get acted on very often. And if legislators saying, oh, we might put it in a supplemental, like they can also introduce legislation themselves to have it heard in a committee to undo this or change this. And I would encourage you, if you hear them say, well, I'll see if a supplemental comes, but like, no, ask them if they don't want to commit to helping you, ask them to get a bill drafted to make the changes that you want, not, oh, we'll wait for a supplemental. Like that, in many cases, is your legislator offering to do nothing for you. And you need to kind of hold them accountable by saying, well, if you agree with this, could you introduce a bill? Because you can introduce a bill to that section of the School Aid Act. It doesn't have to be in the school aid bill. So just think of it that way. Legislators love to play with words, and often make school board members and superintendents feel like they're listening and are on your side, but they aren't actually doing anything for you. I don't mean to sound cynical, but after 18 years of being downtown, I am cynical. So just be aware. 1256. Other topics that are out there in your districts that you might need a board member to respond to, things that are making you wonder what's going on in the world. Well, don't bring that up here. There's lots of things that make us wonder what's going on in the world. That would be a 4-hour conversation. Just other school issues that we got Brad on here, Debbie on here related to leadership, things that you need questions on. I see no hands.
Or can I just make a reminder?
Yep.
So coming up soon is Winter Institute. And so we were talking about learning earlier. And so if you haven't signed up for those classes, please go online and check to see what there is there of interest to you, and make sure anyone who's gotten a new board president, especially in your recent officer elections, considers taking the board president's workshop either at the Institute virtually in February, or the one that we'll have here in person at the office the first weekend in May.
Yeah, thank you for that, Debbie. In talking to a lot of superintendents last fall and that board president's workshop and preparing the person that you selected to be your president, there's lots of unknowns for people that you might watch a board president do their thing and be like, oh, I know what's involved in the job, but until you're in the seat, you don't know what's involved in that job. And the work that Debbie does to help train our individual people that are going into that is just tremendous. So make sure that you're talking to the people that you've put in those positions, and think about having them sign up so that they can hear from Debbie and our other instructors on what it truly means to be a effective board president, because it can lead to a better functioning board, or in fact end up not having a functioning board that if your board president's not prepared for that role. So thank you for bringing that up, Debbie. Oh wait, there is a question, Valerie. During election of officers, can board members vote 2 times on the same positions?
I'm assuming that means you have 2 individuals running for one office, and you do a roll call vote, and the person votes twice, once for the first candidate and again for the second candidate. No, in no election can you vote twice.
Thanks for that clarification, and good question, Valerie.
Yeah.
And I will say it like on that one, Valerie, but any for others. Clearly, Debbie offered, if you have questions on, board issues, reach out to her. If you have follow-up legal questions for Brad, reach out to him and do that directly so that you get the answers that you need for your specific situation. Sometimes hard in this venue to get into specifics. So know that we're always available for those direct questions. All right. Looks like we're at 1 o'clock, and I will say, recognizing your time, thank you very much for being on. Debbie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge on board elections, and Brad, your legal expertise, and Larissa for getting this set up and keeping us moving forward for all of these. So, oh, wait, just curious, if your board president's mother is a teacher in the district, how do you handle the signing of contracts or other teacher-related items that could be viewed as a conflict of interest?
Well, there are conflict of interest laws that apply to that situation, but apply when the board president is voting on the individual's contract, or voting on some other matter related to the compensation of that individual. It's a local decision whether the board feels comfortable with the board president signing the collective bargaining agreement that staff member is a part of. I think that would be completely legal if the board was comfortable with that. But yeah, it's a local decision, in that regard.
Kimberly, your question on superintendent evaluation. I would reach out to Kevin Kelly in our office, and I think he would be able to begin to help you with that. And so that would be my advice on contacting him on superintendent evaluation. And Larissa just posted his email address in the chat. So thank you for being on top of that, Larissa, as well. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. I hope that the new year continues well for all of you, and appreciate your work that you're doing in your local districts. Have a good week.